Book 2. So after the poem that we just read, she, philosophy is silent, and Boethius is silent. And she says, if I have fully diagnosed the cause and nature of your condition, you are wasting away and pining and longing for your former good fortune. Okay? Book 2 is all about fortune, good and bad fortune, how one reacts to it and such. Okay? I'm going to try and go through this more quickly. It is the loss of this, his former good fortune, his power, his prestige, his fame, his library, his wife, his children, etc., not in that order. It is the loss of this which, as your imagination works upon you, has so corrupted your mind. I know the many disguises of that monster, fortune, and the extent to which she seduces with friendship the very people she is striving to cheat. Okay? So she asks, top of page 23, what is it then, O mortal man, that has thrown you down into the slough of grief and despondency? You must have seen something strange and unexpected. But you are wrong if you think fortune has changed toward you. See, his life up until the banishment has been what? Boethius had a good life. Really, he did. He was born to a very old line in Rome. His parents were wealthy, well-known, well-educated, Christians. Father was relatively high-ranking, and Boethius, I don't remember if his parents died, but Boethius was adopted by somebody even wealthier, more well-known, more well-respected, etc. Okay? A man named Symmachus. Your introduction mentions it. And Symmachus, when Boethius is older, in his teens, gives his daughter, Boethius's, what would you call this, adopted sister, gives him her in marriage. And she has got the greatest reputation, all right? So his own family line, that he knows entirely who he's descended from, is very well respected. His adopted family, very, very well respected. He is Boethius, is very well educated. We don't know where he received his education, so to speak. And he starts translating. He makes a name for himself, and it's because he makes a name for himself early that he is given these high positions, ultimately coming up to, nearly second, in fact, he is second in command to Theodoric, the king. He is the one who essentially controls who can see Theodoric. Kind of like the presidential chief of staff. I mean, that's pretty high ranking, right? Everything in his life, just going up. And then he has this one problem. Okay, it's a big problem. He gets thrown in prison, charged with capital offense, right? But her philosophy's point is change is normal to fortune. But for Boethius, fortune has worked like this, right? He's always been at the top of the wheel that we talked about with Oedipus. And she tells him, skipping a couple more lines, I'm going to throw in a now. Now, you have discovered the changing faces of the random goddess. To others, she still veils herself, that is, they're down on the bottom of the wheel, but to you, she has revealed herself to the full. That is, you are satisfied with her ways, you must accept them and not complain. We thought fortune was great before. This is what she does, okay? So this is the point of this entire chapter. Fortune always changes. That's it. You've just been blessed all of your life. Well, now you get to experience what the other half experience, essentially. It would be akin to stock market crash and the tech stocks and Amazon tank. I mean, lose all their value. What's his name in charge of Amazon? His mind just slipped my memory. He wouldn't be poor. because he's got other money than stocks, but he would lose an awful lot of wealth. Bill Gates wouldn't be poor because he has, foundations and all that kind of stuff, but he would lose an awful lot of wealth. Okay. It's kind of what they're talking about. So she goes on, page 23, about a third of the way up from the bottom of the page. Either way, fortune's very mutability deprives her threats of their terror and her enticements of their allure. Because fortune always changes, that wheel always turns. If you're on the downhill slide, if you can be patient, if you can bear it, what's going to happen? Things will get better. And if you're on the uphill slide, at some point, what's going to happen? You're going to reach the top, and then you're going to start to fall again. Okay? So, she talks about, in the poem at the end of chapter 1 of that book, the image of her wheel. Okay? And Boethius gives us this image of her wheel. And the image is not new to Boethius. It shows up in earlier Greek works, etc. But it's his image and portrayal that so dominates the Middle Ages. Chaucer loves this image. We see it throughout Chaucer. We see it in Shakespeare all over. Okay? So she goes on, chapter 2, and she says, I want to let fortune give us her own arguments. So fortune essentially speaks. Right? And fortune essentially says, why do you burden me each day, old man, with your querulous accusation? Why are you accusing me of being unfair? I never said I was going to be fair. And that's what all of page 24 and 25 are essentially about. She says, for example, on page 25, about 8 or 9, 10 lines down, you have no right to complain as if what you have lost was fully your own. The only reason you had great fortune before, I gave it to you. It wasn't yours. Okay? Takes that away. So you get a poem on page 26. If plenty from her well-stocked horn with generous hand should distribute as many gifts as grains of sand, the sea churns up when strong winds blow, blah, 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 blah. No man, end of the poem, is rich who shakes and groans, convinced that he needs more. The rich man who says, I'm not rich enough, is not rich. Okay? What's that mean? Boethius, you were never really rich because you wanted not necessarily additional wealth. He just wanted it to continue. Book 3. Okay? Philosophy says, if Fortune herself had been speaking, because that wasn't literally fortune, that was philosophy playing the role of fortune, she would have left you without a single syllable you could utter by way of reply. But, maybe you want to try. So you want to try and counter the arguments? And Boethius says yes. It is only while one is actually listening to what? To philosophy that one is filled with pleasure. And for the wretched, the pain of their suffering goes deeper. That is, when I listen to you, I feel consoled. So as soon as your words stop sounding in our ears, the mind is weighed down again by its deep-seated melancholy. That is, when you are speaking as philosophy, not as fortune, I feel at ease, I feel at peace. But once you stop, all the problems of the world are back on my shoulders. She says, you're right. And when the time comes, I will apply something calculated to penetrate deep inside. Well, what's deep inside? The real root of his problem. So what does she mean? When the time comes, I'll get a bigger scalpel and I'll slice that wound and I'll dig and probe until we find the splinter that is causing your distress. So she asks him, have you forgotten how fortunate you have been in many ways? Okay, he's had a blessed life, right? And she goes on and says, page 28, in my opinion, you beguiled fortune with empty words. That is, you kind of deceived fortune with empty words. What? So long as you had her caresses and she cherished you as her darling. As long as life was going so well for you. Try to see where that light is. Hold on just 1 second. So she goes on. Page 28. Almost exact middle of the page. If you thought of all the things that have happened to you, what kind of things they were, and whether they were happy or unhappy things, you would not be able to say you have not been fortunate up to now. She says, if you really looked at your life and everything you experienced, you would have to say you've been very fortunate. Okay? So, you know there is no constancy in human affairs when a single swift hour can bring a man to nothing. What difference do you think, skipping a few sentences, it makes whether it is you that quit her by dying or she that quits you by desertion? What does it matter? Whether or not, fortune continues for you. I mean, you can quit fortune by dying. You'll no longer receive fortune, obviously, or she can leave you. What's the difference in that? Look at the end of the poem. Okay? Notice, by the way, what has happened. The poems now come at the end of each chapter after the prose material. So the poem says, page 29, at the end, the world stays rarely long the same, so great its instability. So put your faith in transient luck and trust in wealth's mortality. In law eternal it lies decreed, that not from change is ever freed. That's kind of the law of fortune down here. Change is the nature of life, period. If you don't like change, seek it elsewhere. Seek stability, permanence elsewhere. Boethius says, you're right, I agree. End of the first paragraph. In all adversity of fortune, the most wretched kind is once to have been happy. What term could you use to describe Boethius at this point? Ungrateful? I mean, think about it. In all adversity of fortune, the most wretched kind is once to have been happy. Why? Because the once to have been implies one no longer is. That's the worst thing at all. To have been happy and to no longer be happy. Rather than looking at it as, wow, what a blessing. I was once happy. Something I'd never thought about before in relation to this. Y'all know who Mother Teresa is? Was a great nun, worked in the streets of Calcutta for 50 years, helping the poor, the destitute, unwed pregnant women, delivering children and such. Well, she received this vocation, this call, in, I think it was 1947. She was on a train and she had a vision. And in that vision, Christ spoke to her and told her to go to Calcutta and to treat the outcasts. India, still today, then even stronger, had a caste system. And if you were outcast, that meant you were persona non grata. You were nothing to the rest of society. Okay? And Calcutta is one of the largest, densest populated cities in the world, right? And it has a terrible poverty problem. So she had this vision, this beautiful, sweet vision of Jesus, right? And so she got approval from her superior priest, went to Calcutta, founded an order of nuns. They assisted her in her duties and such. And she died in 1997, the very same day Princess Diana died, right? It wasn't known until several years later, after some of her letters were published. She did not want these letters published. They were supposed to be burned, and they were letters to a priest. That after that vision of Christ that she had, she never had anything like that ever again. In fact, in the letters, she describes that after that vision, it was as if God turned his back to her. She felt that her prayers were unanswered. She felt that God didn't hear her, etc. And yet, and this is why I'm using this to draw to the distinction with Boethius. What did she do? She remained faithful to the vision. She kept helping the people of Calcutta for 50 years. Okay? So philosophy says, but you are suffering because of your misguided belief, and you can't blame events for that. See, she says, you're not suffering because of Theodoric, because of the king. You're suffering because of your wrong thinking. If you are really so moved by the empty name of chance happiness, you can reckon up with me now the number of the very great blessings you still enjoy. And if you find that you still possess that which among all the gifts of fortune was most precious to you, and find it through God's power unharmed and still untouched, you will hardly be able to talk about misfortune with any justice while you still possess outstanding blessings. Okay, so what does that mean? She's saying, you can't talk really about pain and suffering and the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to quote Shakespeare's Hamlet, unless what? Unless you've experienced them personally. And up until this point, he hasn't. Okay? So she's saying, you're complaining now, it's invalid. C.S. Lewis, who I've mentioned before, and I'm going to mention several times because this book really influenced me. C.S. Lewis wrote in 1940 a book called The Problem of Pain. It was a rational examination of why is there pain in the world? Pain broadly configured, evil. Where's pain when God is good, kind of a thing, right? It, like all of Lewis's very rational, argumentative books, it's very well reasoned. It follows all the rules of logic, etc. And yet, it's not totally convincing. He later on wrote two other books. He wrote many other books. That better deal with pain to an extent. One of those is his very last novel called Till We Have Faces, which is very Boethian. And the last one is called A Grief Observed, written about the death of his wife. Okay? He writes Till We Have Faces because of his wife. That is, he's suffering writer's block and meets her and everything. And this idea that he's had for decades just flows. It's a mythic retelling. It's a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. But it's kind of from a Christian perspective, but without any Christian language, kind of like the Consolation of philosophy, so to speak. A Grief Observed is about her death. And it's really a come to Jesus moment. It's about a guy who suffers real pain. I mean, Lewis was a confirmed old bachelor when he met the woman who became his wife. I mean, he was like 56 or so, happy. She comes into his life, turns everything upside down, and then gets cancer and dies 4 years later. All right? Now he knows what pain, real pain, is. I'm not saying he's never suffered pain before. I mean, he suffered the pain of his parents, deaths and things like that. Suffered pain of friends dying in World War I. He was in World War I. Suffered the pain of losing friendships. J.R.R. Tolkien had been his best friend, etc. But, I mean, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh kind of pain. And he works through it. Okay? And you get the same kind of thing. I had to experience it to really understand it. So she goes on. And she talks about his father-in-law. Okay? Talks about his wife. It says, page 30, towards right about in the middle of the page, you are a happy man then if you know where your true happiness lies. Since when the chief concern of mortal men is to keep their hold on life, you even now possess blessings which no one can doubt are more precious than life itself. Well, what are some of those blessings? He still has a wife. He still has a father-in-law. He's still sucking air. Okay? He says, yeah, and I hope those things continue. He doesn't want his wife to die. He doesn't want, Symmachus to die and such. So she says, if you're no longer dissatisfied with the whole of your fortune, the good and the bad, we've made a little progress. Right? He now kind of accepts the bad. He can live with that, so to speak. So she says, but I can't put up with your dilly-dallying and the dramatization of your careworn, grief-stricken complaints that something is lacking from your happiness. No man is so completely happy that something somewhere does not clash with his condition. In other words, name the person who is totally happy. I'm not going to find it. It's the nature of human affairs to be fraught with anxiety. They never prosper perfectly and they never remain constant. That is, human affairs. Okay? No one finds it easy, top of page 31, to accept the lot fortune has sent him. We all feel at one point or another that we've been dealt a bad hand. There is something in the case of each of us that escapes the notice of the man who has not experienced it and causes horror to the man who has. Nothing is miserable. I'm skipping several lines. This is right in the middle of page 31. Nothing is miserable except when you think it so, and vice versa. Nothing is wonderful except you think it so. All luck is good luck to the man who bears it with equanimity. That is, goodness of will. Okay? No one is so happy that he would not want to change his lot if he gives in to impatience. Such is the bittersweetness of human happiness. We're going to come back to the first line in a minute. To him that enjoys it, it may seem full of delight, but he cannot prevent it slipping away when it will. It is evident, therefore, how miserable the happiness of human life is. Notice the seeming paradox. How miserable the happiness of human life is. Why is it miserable? Because it doesn't last. It does not remain long with those who are patient. It doesn't satisfy those who are troubled. Why then do you mortal men seek after happiness outside yourselves? Like in this beautiful house I'm sitting in. When happiness, lies within. What does she mean? Nothing is miserable except when you think it's so. Nothing is wonderful except you think it's so. Proverbs says, I saved it. Proverbs 23:7. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. If you're happy in here, you're happy up here. If you're sad in here, you're sad up here. If you are, St. Paul's words, content in all things, then whatever happens to you, cool. You're content. I ask you whether there is anything more precious to you than your own self. She goes on, same page. You will say no. So if you're in possession of yourself, if you own yourself, if you control yourself, you will possess something you would never wish to lose and something fortune could never take away, right? Because fortune can't affect the self. Other people can't affect the self. Other people can affect what? Your emotions. And if you lose your temper, then what happens? Something else gains control. If happiness is the highest good of rational nature, and anything that can be taken away is not the highest good, since it is surpassed by what can't be taken away, fortune can't hope to lead to happiness. Right? I mean, that makes total sense. If you claim you're completely, totally, perfectly happy, and then you're not, then you're not. Why? Because you're missing something. You're lacking something. That's what she means. So if you're in a state of total, perfect, complete happiness, then you can never be missing or lacking or wanting something. Okay? Chapter 5. So if the gifts that fortune offers, page 33, are not transitory and short-lived, tell me, which is there among them that can ever belong to you or whose worthlessness is not revealed by a moment's thoughtful consideration? And what are those gifts? Well, she's going to talk about them. Okay? Riches, honor, prestige, office, fame, those all exist outside the self. None of those are inside. So, she says, page 35. What in fact is it that you are looking for in all this outcry against fortune? To put poverty to flight with plenty? If so, it turns out to be the very opposite. Why? Because even when you have much, what tends to happen? You want more. In other words, the much that you have isn't enough. He who hath much wants much. And the wants there, both meanings of the word. Wants much, that is, desires much. It also means lacks much. He who has much lacks much. Why? Because he wants more. It seems as if you feel a lack of any blessing of your own inside you, which is driving you to seek your blessings in things separate and external. And so when a being, human, endowed with a godlike quality in virtue of his rational nature, the godlike quality is reason, thinks that his only splendor lies in the possession of inanimate goods, it's the overthrow of the natural order. Because you have this godlike nature within you, rationality, she says, if you seek that happiness, those blessings out there, you are overthrowing what you are really made to be. Why? Because seeking those things isn't fulfilling that godlike nature of reason and rationality. It doesn't fulfill that inner happiness. Right? Other creatures are content with what is their own, but you, and the other creatures there mean the lower creatures, but you, whose mind is made in the image of God, seek to adorn your superior nature, human, superior to the rest of the animal because of being godlike, with inferior objects like clothing, cars, telephones, TVs, stuff, oblivious of the great wrong you do your Creator. Because how do you become more like God? Up here. And in here, actually. It's both. By training the mind and by practicing in the heart the virtues. Right? Let's see. Go on to book 6, chapter 6, sorry. And she says, she talks about dignities of high power, high office and power. And she says, I don't want to talk about that. Let's see here. Page 38, just past the middle of the page. The only way one man can exercise power over another is over his body and what is inferior to it, his possessions. So, it's like the only way I could exercise power over you is if I had somehow power over your body. I put you in shackles, in handcuffs, okay? And I could control what is less than you, that is your belongings. I could take your car, okay? You cannot impose anything on a free mind. That is, I could do those things, but what could I not do? I couldn't do anything to your mind. Okay? And you cannot move from its state, the mind's state, of inner tranquility, a mind at peace with itself and firmly founded on reason. A couple of examples. During the period of the Soviet Union in what is now modern day Russia, but was then the Soviet Union, the Soviets put all kinds of people into what's called the Gulag, their concentration camps, okay? Included among many of those were thousands, probably tens of thousands of Russian Orthodox priests and monks, because the Soviet state was entirely atheist. They didn't want anybody who said, I have a loyalty to somebody else, okay? And there's an account of one priest whose name was Father Arseny, right? And there's a book about him, and it includes accounts by people who served with him in these prisons, because he would get moved around from one to another. And the miraculous things that happened. Because Father Arseny was always sure, no matter what occurred to him, who ultimately was in control. I mean, what Boethius is talking about here, okay? And this guy was beaten mercilessly, not only by the authorities, but by other prisoners. Because among the other prisoners were gangsters, thugs, et cetera, et cetera. And it got to the point where, whatever prison he was in, because of how he would respond to the beatings, that the prisoners started developing a love for him and protecting him from other prisoners, okay? Because he would also, quote unquote, minister to their needs. Somebody had a broken leg, he would bind it, help it heal, et cetera, et cetera. Another case. So he never let the external circumstances affect his inner peace. Another circumstance, another Orthodox priest, and this guy's name is Father Roman Braga. He was Romanian, okay? He was thrown in prison by the Romanian communists in the 1940s. I once heard him give a talk, mind-blowing. And he talked about that he never really came to know God until he was in solitary confinement. He said, I used to blah, blah, talk about God, give homilies, etc. He said, I wasn't forced to confront God face to face, so to speak, until he was in solitary confinement. Why? Because in solitary confinement, he could not look for any joy, any happiness, anything outside himself. Because he was in a literal, 3 foot by 3 foot cell. Couldn't even lay down. And what did he do? He had to turn inward. Christ tells us in Luke, the kingdom of God is within. In fact, Roman Braga, I think he's written a book called The Universe Within, looking inwardly. Well, that's what philosophy is talking about here, right? You cannot touch a free mind. You can touch a person's body all you want. You can beat them till whatever, but you can't touch the mind. Okay? She goes on, so page 40 says at the top. So these are some of the issues she's been addressing so far. So neither riches, power, nor high office can properly be called by these words, that is, blessings and sources of happiness. And these are all things that fortune bestows. And because fortune can bestow them, fortune can take them away. So she says, and lastly, we may reach the same conclusion about fortune. She has nothing worth pursuing, no trace of intrinsic good. She never associates with good men, does not turn into good men those with whom she does associate. Okay? And then Boethius speaks. And he says, bottom of page 40, I had sought the means of engaging in politics so that virtue should not grow old unpraised. He wanted to expound virtue. He wanted to promote virtue, etc. And philosophy replies, top of the next page. And that is the one thing that could entice minds endowed with natural excellence, though not yet perfected with the finishing touch of complete virtue, the desire for glory. But just think how puny and insubstantial, that is, no essence. It's not real. Such fame really is. And then she goes on and talks about fame and reputation and human glory, etc., etc. Okay? Page 42, almost to the middle of the page. When you think of your future fame, you think you are creating for yourself a kind of immortality, right? That your name will go on long after you are dead. But if you think of the infinite recesses of eternity, you have little cause to take pleasure in any continuation of your name. If you think of eternity from here forward, what's your point? What's going to happen to your fame? It will die out. I mean, there are pharaohs who surely thought by building great, monuments, etc., that no longer exist, that people would always, and we don't know who they are. The Old English word Beowulf, it's chock full of names. And it's thought that the names are probably historical. We know nothing about any of these people because nothing survives of them. Okay? So you can't talk about the fame or reputation of that individual because we don't know what it is. She goes on. The span of a single second can be compared with 10,000 years, middle 42. But minute though it may be, it still has a value in proportion because each is a finite measure of time. Right? While finite things can be compared with one another, the finite and the infinite can't. So however protracted the life of your fame, however long your fame goes on, when compared with unending eternity, it's nothing. Absolutely nothing. Right? You, however, don't know how to act uprightly except with an eye to popular favor and empty reputation. You only, and she is speaking to Boethius, so she might mean him directly and personally. But because Boethius is writing this and he's using the voice of philosophy, he might mean us collectively as humans. Right? You don't know how to act uprightly except with an eye. You don't behave properly except what? For popular favor or for empty reputation. What's the meaning of integrity? What's the real meaning of integrity? Doing the same thing for the right reasons when you know no one is looking. That's honor. Okay? Again, Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. Wow, hadn't thought of this. In the third book, Return of the King, Aragorn is speaking with um, Eowyn. And she wants to ride off to glory with him. She wants to ride off and fight and ultimately die. Okay? And Eowyn's trying to tell her duty is to do what she accepted to do. Which she thinks he's just saying, you're a woman, you can't get, martial glory and such. This is on page 784 in the one volume edition. She says, shall I always be left behind when the riders depart to mind the house while they wind renown and find food and beds? In other words, am I always going to be a serving woman? Am I always going to have to do the woman's job of cleaning the house, making the meals and stuff? That's not Aragorn. That's not what he's saying. And Aragorn says, and this gets exactly to the point she's making, the time may come soon when none will return. That is, when no soldiers will return from the battlefield. Then there will be need of valor without renown. Okay? What does he mean? For none shall remember the deeds that are done in the last defense of your homes. He's saying, then you will need to show your true valor, even though no one will ever remember it. No one will ever sing about it. His point? That will be the real valor. That will be the real glory. Why? Because it won't be tainted by fame or reputation or songs, etc. Right? She says, you ignore those excellent qualities, kind of like the valor I was just talking about. But she says these qualities, a good conscience and virtue, and pursue your reward in the common gossip of people. Part of her point, a good conscience and virtue are their own reward. Why? She's going to make this argument later. Because a good conscience and virtuous behavior lead to a good conscience and even more virtuous behavior. Good begets good. Evil begets evil. Listen while I tell you how cleverly someone once ridiculed the shallowness of this kind of receipt. So she gives an example. She says, but it's great men we're considering, men who seek, I'm skipping the example, page 43, men who seek fame for virtue. What do they care about reputation when the body grows lifeless in death, which ends all things? If the whole man dies, body and soul, a belief which reason forbids us, in other words, she doesn't accept the idea that the soul dissipates upon death, that there is really no soul. She says, but if that's the case, fame means nothing. Reputation means nothing. But if the mind stays conscious, when it's freed from the body and seeks out heaven and freedom, surely it will despise every earthly affair. That is, before the leaving of the body. If the mind is conscious after death, then before death, the mind that is aware of that will say, none of this stuff here really matters. What matters is what happens to the mind after death. At the end of Harry Potter, the first book, Dumbledore tells Harry that Nicholas Flamel and his wife Perenelle have destroyed the Philosopher's Stone. So they'll no longer be able to make the elixir of immortality. And Harry says, but they'll die, won't they? And Dumbledore says, yes, they'll die. And he says, to one as young as you, it's got to seem very odd. And he says, I have the book here. He says, to the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure. Why to the well-organized mind? because it doesn't care about immortality here on earth. And it doesn't care about the other thing the Philosopher's Stone can create, untold riches. Okay? I'm going to come back to a later passage in that later. So notice what she's saying here. If you live your life as though dead, you don't care about reputation. You don't care what other people say to you. Polonius tells his son Laertes in Shakespeare's Hamlet to take every man's censure, but to give none. That is, if someone criticizes you, listen to it, but don't criticize back. And the reason for that is when you take other people's criticism, it might be beneficial. And if it's not beneficial, it bounces off. It's unimportant, right? Book 8. Let's see here. No, I'm not going to talk about that. Book 8, chapter 8 of book 2, page 44. She says, I'm going to tell you a paradox. And so I'm hardly able to put it into words. For bad fortune, I think, is more use to a man than good fortune. Bad luck is more beneficial than good luck. Good fortune always seems to bring happiness, but deceives you with her smiles, whereas bad fortune is always truthful. Why? Because by change she shows her true fickleness. Bad fortune shows us how fickle and inconstant fortune is. It shows us the reality of the world. So what do I mean by that? Or what does she mean by that? Here's an example. Here's a perfect example from personal history. You know how we found out my father had a brain tumor? He fell down some stairs. Stairs that he should not have been able to use. Those stairs should have been blocked off. I was really angry when I found out he was still able to get to those stairs. And yet, if he hadn't fallen down those stairs, he never would have gone to the emergency room. He never would have had a brain CT scan and an MRI. And we never would have discovered that he has this inoperable brain tumor that's going to cause his death probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Okay? That is an example of bad fortune, what normally we would consider to be bad fortune, having a how did she put it? Bringing more use to us than good fortune. Okay? She says, bad fortune gives men release through the recognition of how fragile a thing happiness is. Happiness, what? Doesn't last. And, this is a lesson our society needs to relearn. Because people your age have largely, I'm not saying you have largely been raised on this notion or been taught this notion that life should be fair. Well, that's just wrong. You could talk should be, could be, would be, till you're blue in the face. The problem is it isn't. You got to deal with what is real, with the reality that we have. And the reality that we have is that happiness is fleeting. It doesn't last. Okay? In terms of the happiness that is brought from external things, other people, stuff, wealth, all that stuff. Okay? So, book 8 finishes, chapter 8 finishes with her saying before the poem, so you were weeping over lost riches, when you have really found the most precious of all riches, friends who are true friends. Okay? You are reaping over lost riches, physical, exterior, sensual things, when you have really found the most precious riches of all. These are interior. Okay? And then she gives the poem, and halfway through the poem we read, and all this chain of things, because the poem's about harmony in nature, all this change of things in earth and sea and sky, one ruler holds in hand. If love relaxed the reins, all things that now keep peace would wage each continual war and wreck the great machine which unity maintains with motions beautiful. Love, too, holds peoples joined by sacred bond of treaty and weaves the holy knot of marriage's pure love. Love promulgates the laws for friendship's faithful bond. O happy race of men, if love who rules the sky could rule your hearts as well. Okay? That is the source of true happiness. So, what have we seen philosophy do in book 2? Philosophy points out all the things that we tend to associate with happiness and joy are false friends. Wealth, long life, people, treasures, things, stuff, exterior things to us don't last. There's an old English poem, how did I put it, called The Wanderer. The Wanderer reads, towards the end of it, the speaker says, all is toilsome, this is line 106, in the Liuser translation in Old English Poetry and Anthology. All is toilsome in the earthly kingdom, the working of weird, which is the Germanic notion kind of fate. The working of weird changes the world under heaven. Notice change. Here, our world. Wealth is fleeting, here friends are fleeting, here man is fleeting, here woman is fleeting. All the framework of this earth will, future, stand empty. And the Old English word there for empty is idel. It's the word from which we get idle. It doesn't only mean empty. It means useless. If a car engine is idling, it's just running, right? The engine is just running. But what is the car doing? It's standing still. An idling engine is no good until you put it into gear and move forward or in reverse. It's not doing what it is designed to do. Similarly, in that context, the world without man, without woman, without friends, without king, it's useless. Okay? All right, I'll do another one for book 3.